Hi, welcome to Cubs and Culture for February 11th, 2018, continuing our exploration of the Inarritu filmography. This is Babel, his third film, released in 2006. It's probably his most ambitious film in terms of thematic and locational scope. In the end, it's not quite unified. The pieces don't fully fit together to make a fully satisfying whole. In his Death trilogy, which is Love's a Bitch and then 21 Grams, it's probably the least polished of the least most ambitious of the three, but also the sort of the last of the three. Now, with that being said, the lesser film by Inarritu is still better, like 90% of the stuff. Okay, so it concerns, it's four interlocking stories, or four interlocking sets of people. The main sort of chunk of the story is an American couple's in Morocco, trying to deal with their young infant dying of SIDS. And then the wife gets shot, and then them trying to get rescued and dealing with that. And then so that's one of the stories in Morocco. The other story in Morocco is two kids from a farmer, herder, are basically goofing around, and they're the one who shoots her. And then them being tracked down by police and trying to work that out. So those two stories, which are deeply interlocked, are sort of the main chunk of the movie. Then you have a sub story involving the American couple's nanny who has to go to Mexico for her son's wedding, and because the woman was shot in Morocco, they're not home in time, so she ends up taking their children, who are American citizens, to Mexico, and they have problems crossing the border back. And then the fourth story is the rifle that was used by the Moroccan herders is actually a gun from Japan, where a Japanese hunter on vacation, I don't know, like a year before the movie took place, traded as a gift. And so there's a Japanese segment where it's that man's daughter, who is deaf, dealing with her mother's suicide and also not connecting, and it's sort of an angsty coming of age story. One thing I really do like about how the stories interlock is the further you get away geographically, the further away the causation is. So, like, the two Moroccan stories, one, like, the kids utterly caused the other one. And the Japanese story, very tingent. Like, so, like, further you are geographically, further you are causally. So that's sort of neat. The stories are all sort of good on themselves, and I like the sort of interway in which they interlock. The other thing is, obviously, within the title Babel, which is, yes, a reference to the Tower of Babel, it's obviously about miscommunications and misintentions, because there's no real, like, villain in this. The antagonism is people not being able to understand each other, and people desperately trying to connect. The thing that I like about it is in every single one of the stories, there's one of the characters does something silly or misguided. So, for example, the nanny taking the kids to her son's wedding across the border, that was a sort of a misguided decision, but it really, in of itself, it's not fully, it doesn't really become tragic until the state gets involved. And so there's this huge sort of underlying tension or point that while human beings are separate, and we have trouble communicating with each other because of culture, and sort of also just personally, because like the American couple dealing with their child's death, like they don't communicate well, so it's interpersonal. It doesn't really become, which is a problem, and it causes issues and maybe some sadness, but it doesn't become truly tragic until the state and borders and nations get involved, and that sort of the underlying thread of all the sort of tragedy is the notion of nationality or borders. Causes the issues, because like in the Moroccan stories, the cops are absolutely pricks trying to hunt down because they think they're a terrorist, the two kids who are just foolish. Likewise, the U.S. Embassy in the Morocco government were got into a pissing match trying to get help, and the woman almost died because of that. Crossing the border, etc. And the sort of the Mexican section, sort of the problem. In terms of that, so it's about how we're divided by culture, but the divides only become become violent because of nations, which I think is a really interesting humanistic point. Give me a moment, please. Directorially, yeah, it's still nice. This is probably the film where his camera is the least personalized, because it's the way in which Inarritu sort of directorial signature comes in is actually not so much through in-scene stuff, but how the scenes are cut together. So he uses a lot of sort of interesting juxtaposition. So like he would cut between he cuts from like sort of the happy scene of the Mexican wedding to the tragic scene of the woman, the American tourist bleeding out in a Moroccan village, etc. And so directorially, it's solid direction, but it's much more editing that does this film. Where not only is it keeping track of the 4 different groups of people relatively well, but there's really nice tensions and juxtapositions that help it get the point across, because you always sort of you always sort of get the point of each story because of the relationship to the other. So the cutting between the 4 groups of people really help with that sort of thing. The other thing in terms of like direction is most of the actors in it, the cast is absolutely wonderful. Nominally Brad Pitt is probably the protagonist, because he's the most active character. He's also the one that goes through, the 3 of the 4 stories. But other than him, each of the actors don't have a lot of screen time, and they all make most of it. It was nominated for 2 supporting actresses, the Japanese teenager, and the nanny. I actually also would have given Bernal best supporting actor. He's really good. He's only in the movie for like 7 minutes, 8 minutes maybe, but he's really he's sort of menacing, and you kind of don't fully understand what his problem is, and how he's sort of reckless and striking in that way. And so the acting is everyone with minimum screen time. All the actors make their characters feel alive, which is really good. Now, the thing that I like best about this film is actually its score. Because, which it won the Oscar for. The score uses location flavor. So there's Mexican music in Mexico. There's somewhat J-pop in Japan, etc. And it could have felt very much like a National Geographic special, but using very simple and sort of minimalistic guitar, mariachi type stuff, actually, to give it simple emotional shape throughout the entire film. It really works well. It's an interesting piece of writing, so it feels like all the locations. So it feels the score feels unified, And it doesn't feel like a travel log, which is kind of cool despite having obvious location flavorings on it. Okay, so there's that. So at the end of the day, like I said at the beginning of this, Babel was Inarritu's sort of most ambitious film in terms of